During this time, we had a big fear of communism because the Cold War was still at its peak. We had a very huge distrusting government thanks to the Watergate scandal and President Nixon. For you, in order just to get your car filled up, you had to wait in line 3 hours just to get your car filled up with gas because of the shortage. Interest rates were skyrocketing. Unemployment was through the roof. And the history of oral office at the University of California, Berkeley said that this recession during this time was the most significant since the Great Depression. It almost seemed like we needed a miracle to pull ourselves out of this bad situation. Well, I'm here to tell you that the 1980 U.S. men's Olympic hockey team gave America that miracle. And what it did is that it gave us confidence, not only to give us patriotism again, but in order to defeat communism. I'm going to go over that by showing a quick brief history of the 1970s and talk about the game itself, and then I'm going to go ahead and talk about what life was like after that. As a big hockey fan and as a proud American, I can easily talk about this for hours without even doing research. So let's go into the late 1970s. One of the biggest things that happened was distrusting government. And the pain was already fresh from Watergate itself, but the Iranian hostage crisis was just add salt to that wound. What happened was that Iranian militants had took over the American embassy that was over in Iran. Public broadcasting stations said that 60 hostages were taken, and this hostage situation lasted 444 days. These hostages were not released until days after President Carter was out of office and it was President Reagan that took over. There were a lot of fingers pointed at President Carter, and that just added to our distrust that we had in our own American government. Not only was that going on, there was fear of communism. In December 1979, the Soviet Union had decided to invade Afghanistan. This was key because this was the only nation the Soviets had invaded outside of the Eastern Soviet bloc, and that information came from the Office of History. The Eastern Soviet bloc was basically those countries that the Soviet Union had control of since it began. Now, this caused such an uproar that because 1980 Olympics was being held in Moscow, Russia, so President Carter had asked the United States Olympic Committee to actually boycott the games themselves. The New York Times actually got a quote from one of Jimmy Carter's speeches saying, "It is very important for the world to realize how serious of a threat the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is." With all these political implications, it almost seemed like the 1980 Winter Olympics was just going to be a Cold War battle. So let's go into the game. Beforehand, it seemed like the United States just did not have a chance against the Soviet Union. The United States team was made up of a bunch of college kids. Like, how are they going to be able to play together? The Soviet Union, these were grown men that have been playing together for years. They were 4-time gold medal defending champions. They have beaten an NHL All-Star team in an exhibition game. And 2 days before the Olympics, there's an exhibition between the Soviets and the U.S., and they beat us 10-3. Absolutely annihilated us. The game wasn't even close. But despite the whole Moscow situation, they still decided to come over to America to play in the 1980 Winter Olympics, which took place in Lake Placid, New York. Now, in the group round, the United States just barely skated by and just had enough points in order to qualify to get to the medal round itself. Now, the medal round is not an elimination bracket like we have today. The medal round was a round robin style, so you had to actually play all teams that qualified in order to be placed in the standings to see if you won the gold medal. Since the United States played Sweden in the group round, that game counted towards the medal round, and that game was a tie. So their next game in the medal round was against the Soviet Union. The Cold War finally had a battlefield. So we'll start off with the first period. We started off with back-to-back goals. The Soviets scored, the U.S. scored. Then the Soviets got another goal with about 2 minutes left to go in the game. But then, right in the last seconds of the game, U.S. forward Mark Johnson is able to slip goal under Soviet goalie Vladislav Tretiak to tie up the game with just 1 second left going into the second period. At the beginning of the second period, there was a shot that stunned the world. Tretiak was benched, and the Soviet Union had traded their goalie, had put in goalie Vladimir Mishkin. This was huge because Tretiak at the time was known as the greatest goaltender in the world. He was sitting on the bench for this game. Coach Brooks knew he got in the head of the Soviets. However, even with that happening, the The Soviets dominated the second period, outshooting the Americans 12-2 and scoring one more goal. So into the third period, the game was 3-2. In the third, the Soviet Union committed a penalty 6 minutes into the period. With the man advance, the United States was able to get another goal by again Mark Johnson to tie up the game. Then with 10 minutes left in the game, the unthinkable happened.
Long slap shot. Saved by Pushkin. The U.S. team is depending a little bit too much now on Jim Craig. He's making too many good saves. Around the air!
And with that, the United States had a lead. They had a lead against the unbeatable Soviet Union. The Soviets were stunned. They started bombarding goalie Jim Craig with shots, but he was a stone wall. He wasn't letting anything in. Soviet defender Sergei Starkov said in an interview with NBC Sports, "We were panicking. The clock kept winding out. The Soviets kept trying, but nothing was working. 5 seconds were left. 4, 3. We had done it. The United States pulled off the miracle and beat the Soviet Union. A bunch of college kids defeated the Red Machine, and we had won the game." Now, with that, everyone thought we had won the gold medal, but actually, it was not complete. 2 days later, the Americans had to play Finland in another game, which we had won 4-2, giving us the most points, and the United States claimed gold medal. Now, of course, this just seems like a hockey game, right? Well, what kind of impact did it actually leave on our nation itself? That's the next thing we're going to talk about. So, I'm going to talk about how the amount of viewers that watch the game shows the impact, along with our economic change and the fall of communism that happened later on. The amount of viewers that watched this game, according to New York Times, averaged at 34.2 million viewers. The next closest hockey game on record to have that many viewers was the 2010 gold medal game between U.S. and Canada that had 27.6 million viewers. If you think about that, the changes in social media, the internet between those 30 years, that extra 7 million really impacts a lot. Now also, during that time, everyone thought because we defeated the Soviet Union that we had won the gold. If they were paying attention to the United States because of their love of hockey, they would have known that there was still another game to be played. But because of their patriotism, that's why they watched this game. Al Michaels, the man who actually announced the game itself, he sent an interview with book writer Michael Bergen. That was the beauty of the game. You didn't have to understand it. You understand it. You even look at that Sports Illustrated cover, there are no words there. Everyone already knew what happened. There's no need to explain it one more time. Chicago Now writer Chuck Foltz even also stated when he was a child, he went out to the streets, everyone was out there screaming that we beat the Russians, we beat the Russians. It's these guys that won the hockey game, yet we were the ones that defeated those evil commie bastards. Now, just with that, there was also a big change in employment. Around this time, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and he had a huge change in economics, which we now know today as Reaganomics. There's some controversy still being argued today. Was Reaganomics really, that powerful or not? But an article in Forbes magazine says that this was the most successful economic experiment in the world, creating 20 million jobs, and the economy grew 1/3 in size. The reason why this worked is because the Americans, now that we're proud to be American again, we have hope in our government, and we allowed this system to work and allowed our economy to grow. And not only did that happen, but that was when communism began to fall. The Soviet Union around this time began spending way too much money on the military for fear of the United States. San Jose State University Department of Economics said in an article that 70% of the Soviets' industrial output was towards the military, which basically caused their economy to falter. Right in 1989, that's when everything began to lose grip. On November 9th was when the Berlin Wall fell. The Telegraph had a quote from Anthony Chernov, who was the advisor to the Soviet leader at the time, and he quoted saying, "The Berlin Wall has collapsed. This entire era of the socialist system is over." 2 years later, the Soviet Union would follow. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev would eventually decide to resign on December 25th. And then in January 1992, it was voted to call Russia now the Commonwealth of Independent Republics. The Soviet Union was officially dead. Because the the United States had confidence from this hockey game. We were able to show our teeth. We were able to show that communism wasn't going to push us around. And that's what caused Soviet unions to spend so much money in their military and allow communism to eventually fall. I get it. Ronald Reagan was the one that controlled the economics. The Soviet Union had their own internal issues that caused their fall. We get it. It probably would have happened depending on whether or not we won that hockey game or not. But if that hockey game never happened, we never believed in Reagan. Maybe the economics would have worked out this way. The Soviet Union would have feared us. They would have known that they were still number one in the world. Maybe they wouldn't have spent as much money on their military. You never know. But in the end, I think it was this hockey game that caused our economy to rise, our communism to fall, and our patriotism to just skyrocket through the roof. To go over what I just did. Now, seconds are winding down in the third period of my speech, so it's time for me to slide on in and clinch the win here. So to summarize, I went over the history of the late 1970s while it was a bad time for America. I went over the hockey game, and I went over the impact of this hockey game and why it changed history forever. Now, I think we can all agree that modern day America could use something like this hockey game. I would say we're in a similar stage where we were back then. Not great economics, we're having a war with ourselves. I don't think people are trusting our government as much as we used to. Who knows what this miracle could be? Maybe it could be another hockey game, maybe another sporting event, maybe someone could just save a life and can finally bring us together and allow us to be proud to be American here. But I'm going to end this speech with the best way I know how, by letting Al Michaels say the last few seconds of the hockey game. So, if this doesn't give me chills, I don't know what will.